Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the review and recap series for Crime and Punishment. This episode we are carrying on by looking at early modern Britain. However, we're moving on to that first theme again, which is crime. Okay, so we're going to be looking at crime, what changed, what stayed the same in early modern Britain. So, one of the crimes that does undergo a change in early modern Britain is witchcraft. Now, witchcraft and the idea of believing in magic had existed in medieval England. However, people often saw magic as a sort of a good thing and a force for good in medieval England. For example, people often believed in sort of healing women who could perhaps cure ailments and illnesses and diseases. However, in early modern Britain, people become very concerned about what they believe to be black magic, so using magical powers for harm. And that is the key difference between witchcraft accusations and beliefs in medieval times and in early modern Britain. People become concerned that it's now being used for bad things. Now, of course, we know today that witchcraft and magical powers do not, unfortunately, exist. However, that does not stop people in early modern Britain accusing people of witchcraft. And there are lots of reasons as to why the number of accusations in witchcraft rise dramatically during this period. Often, if there was a famine, so a severe lack of food, that might lead to desperation and arguments, which would lead to increased accusations of witchcraft. The plague also did, because people were looking for people to blame for these horrible illnesses and the death of loved ones. The English Civil War had turned England upside down, and it had pitted neighbour against neighbour, so therefore old grudges remained in place even after the Civil War had ended, and it often meant that an accusation of witchcraft was a good way to sort of get your own back on a neighbour that you didn't particularly like during that time, as it might get rid of them. And there was also the fact that there was growing Puritanism at the time. Puritans were very concerned about people straying away from the Bible and the Word of God, and that people were sort of engaging in relations with the devil and trying to corrupt the moral fibres of England. Now, often you would find that the majority of accusations of witchcraft were aimed at women, particularly elderly women who were perhaps isolated or widowed, and this made it very difficult for the accused person to argue back in court, because they would not have that man in court, because don't forget it's a patriarchal society at the time, to defend them. So it was very difficult for anybody to take their defence sort of seriously without having that male backup as well in court. Now, often to find out if a witch was innocent or guilty, you would attend a swimming a witch trial, which is where the accused woman would be bound and tied up with her thumbs to opposing toes, and she would be dunked in water. If she sank, the water, because it was pure, had accepted her, and therefore she was innocent. And at that point, she would either be hauled back out of the water, or perhaps, if it went on too long, she would, of course, drown to death. However, if the water rejected the accused person, so if she was floating on top, that would be a sign that she had the devil's blood or whatever inside her, and therefore she was guilty and would be taken out of the water and then probably executed by hanging. Okay, so it's a bit of a catch-22. There's no good way about it if you're accused as a witch, and like I said, often it was a good way of getting rid of somebody that you didn't particularly like. Another crime that sees a massive rise during this time period is organised crime. So by organised crime, I mean crime that's not just sort of spontaneous. It doesn't just happen out of passion or an argument or anything like that. It's planned. Now, there are different types of organised crime. For example, smuggling in the 17th and 18th century increases massively. And that's due to the fact that the English government raise something called import taxes, which means that any goods you bring into the country, you also have to pay some additional money towards to the government, which meant that goods became very expensive. So often people would buy from smugglers or engage in smuggling because it meant that you could buy goods for much cheaper from them. And it also meant that if you were a poor labourer and you were working as a smuggler at night, you could make a lot of money in your spare time rather than just relying on your honest work that you did in the day. So therefore, smuggling is seen as a social crime, because the upper classes like buying goods from smugglers and the lower classes, the labouring classes, enjoy working as a smuggler because it's good money. It means that people don't really tell the authorities about smugglers. It's not really seen as a proper crime. Now, an example of a smuggling gang is the Hawkhurst gang, and of course, These were an extremely violent group. They murdered customs officials who stole some of their, well, not stole, took back some of their goods that they had illegally brought into the country. So even though people didn't perhaps see smuggling itself as a crime, the Hawkers gang as a smuggling group were very violent. So they were violent criminals. You also get other elements of organised crime, such as highway robbery. So, for example, Dick Turpin in the 17th century was an example of a famous highway robber, and we often think about him as quite a romanticised version where they wouldn't steal from women, and they would often leave their victims unharmed, and sometimes even give back to the poor. But that is not the case. Just like the outlaws in medieval England have been romanticised, such as Robin Hood, the reality of highway robbers in early modern Britain is much different. For example, there is an early modern highway robber called Raby, and he is believed to have cut the finger off of a woman who would not give up her ring. So it shows that, again, these criminals are violent criminals and are dangerous, not to be viewed through rose-tinted sort of spectacles. Now, the reason that highway robbery increases during this time period is because there's more coaches and roads, so more people are travelling about. And of course, as we said in the overview lesson, they're carrying money with them because there is no banks. Heresy. Now, due to the fact that Henry VIII splits from the church, there is now two religions in England. You've got Catholicism, the old religion, and the new religion, Protestantism, which is the religion that King Henry wants people to follow, means that now if you had a religion that was different from the king, you were still a heretic, but it was much more common because there was that split in the church. Of course, different kings and queens might have different religions, and for example, Mary I, who was a devout Catholic, she was a very strong Catholic, burned hundreds of Protestants alive at the stake. Okay, so that punishment for heresy of burning at the stake still continues. Vagrancy. Now, vagrancy does exist in medieval England. However, again, it is another crime that increases during the early modern period. Now, this is largely due to the fact that the population size has increased, so there are more people about anyway. It's also because there are more roads, so people can wander between villages and towns more easily. And also because of things like harvest failure and growing unemployment. People struggle to find work in their towns and villages if they were in the labouring classes, so therefore they would wander to another village and try to find work or beg there instead. And of course, as mentioned in the previous video as well, the printing press spread fears about vagrancy. For example, Thomas Harmon's 1567 book that warned of the dangers of vagrants, and he said that they were sort of con artists who would put like the counterfeit crank, for example, would put soap in his mouth and pretend that he was medically unwell in order to trick people out of money. Now, instances of this were very rare, but Thomas Harmon's book made it seem like all vagrants were therefore sort of cheats and thieves and were taking away from what was known as the godly poor, so those people who truly deserved help. There was also an increase in the persecution of moral crimes. Now, because the Puritan population, that extreme Protestant population, was rising during this time period after Cromwell's victory in the English Civil War, they became increasingly concerned about moral crimes. For example, drinking, swearing, sexual immorality, so having sex outside of marriage, and also another example is scoldings, the idea of women behaving in ways that was considered unladylike at the time. Now, you also get an increase in treason during the early modern period. Again, treason had existed in medieval times, so it's a continuity there, but it did increase during this time. And examples that support this is the idea of the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, when Guy Fawkes and the other 12 members of the Gunpowder Plot plotted to kill King James. And this is coupled with the fact that because King Henry had changed the church, and there's that Protestant religion is the main religion, Catholics felt like they were being maligned and persecuted, so therefore they were more likely to go against the monarch. In terms of overall crime trends then, violence between late medieval nobles declined during this time because they're now more interested in trading to increase their wealth. They have no interest in fighting each other. They want to trade to accumulate more money. Number two, the types of crime committed by ordinary people was the types of crime was the same as it was pretty much in medieval England. The fact that it was mostly a crime against property and not just the person, so not everybody was murdering each other. It was more often that crimes were committed by young males in acts of desperation. So, for example, during famine, they might have stolen something. So petty crimes were more common than serious, and it was often the theft of a low-value item. There was also a big rise in crime from the 1550s, but then there was also a big fall 100 years later in the 1650s, and this kind of coincides with that idea of the rising population. When the population rises massively, it causes more unemployment, more higher food prices, lower wages, so people become more desperate. And then lastly, certain crimes were seen as big problems at different times. For example, as I mentioned, accusations of witchcraft were quite high at the start of the period, when people were concerned about the rising in black magic. Then people become concerned about things like smuggling and then also highway robbery. Vagrancy becomes a major concern in the 1500s due to Thomas Harmon's books. And then throughout this period, the Puritans, as they become stronger in government, they increasingly worry about moral crimes. So different crimes are seen as bigger problems at different points throughout this period of history. That just about wraps up our second episode in the early modern series of the review and recap. The next episode will be on early modern law enforcement, and then following that it will be early modern punishments. So please continue watching if you want to have a look at those. Thank you.